They said not to raise my glass. Not even for the toast. My son leaned over as the room stood and whispered it through a tight smile, his lips barely moving, as if he were delivering a secret order rather than a request. Just let the others speak, Mom. It's better that way. I remember the way the chandelier light bounced off the rim of his champagne flute, the way the gold band on his wedding ring caught the light as he held his glass high, and I remember how I held mine at chest level, trembling slightly, not from anger, not yet, but from something far colder, recognition. I was not a guest of honor at that gala. I was a guest of convenience. My name was on the invitation only because they'd used my money to fund the event. And my story, my hardship, my years of struggle, my sacrifices as a single mother, was part of the promotional material. But my presence? That was negotiable. My voice? Disposable. I'm 81 now. I live alone in a second-floor apartment above a bakery in a town most people fly over without a second thought. But there was a time I shared a house with marble countertops and designer sinks, a time I wore silk scarves and leather gloves, and signed checks with a pen that had my initials etched in gold. That was before I realized that proximity to beauty is not the same as belonging. That was before my own son, the one I raised through illness and poverty and 4-digit overdrafts, taught me what it means to be erased slowly, gracefully, under the guise of decorum. It wasn't always this way, or maybe it was, and I was just too in love with being needed to notice. Daniel was a colicky baby, the kind who cried in long, desperate sobs that made the neighbors knock on the door. His father left when he was 2, said he couldn't live in a house full of noise and unpaid bills. I told myself I didn't need him anyway. I took 3 jobs, one at a school cafeteria, one cleaning offices at night, and one on Sundays at the church folding bulletins and sweeping communion crumbs off the carpet. I didn't complain. There wasn't time. My hands were always busy, peeling apples, sewing loose buttons, counting out coins at the gas station with silent apologies to the clerk. Daniel grew tall and quiet, a child with a brain wired for logic and an allergy to weakness. He wasn't unkind, just clinical. The kind of boy who'd correct your grammar while you were crying. When he got into law school, I sold my car to cover the first semester's deposit. When he bought his first house, I dipped into my pension fund to help with the down payment. He said it was temporary. He said he'd pay it back. But I never asked. Not because I didn't want the money, but because I didn't want to become the kind of mother who made love conditional. That's what I told myself anyway. When he married Carla, I bought a beige dress with a ribbon belt and wore pearls that had belonged to my mother. I smiled through the ceremony, even though I wasn't seated in the front row. Even though no one asked me to give a speech. Even though, when I approached the photographer for a family portrait, he glanced at Carla, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, and then turned away. Later, Daniel said it was just a miscommunication, that of course I was part of the family. But the photos told a different story. I wasn't in them, not one. And now, 15 years later, I know better than to believe in accidents that repeat themselves. The gala was Carla's idea, a benefit dinner for a charity focused on supporting underrepresented family matriarchs. A ridiculous mouthful of a phrase that sounded like it had been cooked up by a team of PR interns. She said they wanted to honor women like me. I almost laughed. I'd never once been honored by anyone in that house. The invitation had gold lettering. It arrived in a black envelope with a wax seal and a return address from a foundation I'd never heard of. Inside, a card with embossed script. We cordially invite you to an evening of gratitude and giving, celebrating the unsung pillars of family resilience. It sounded noble. It sounded like something meant to be framed. I hung it on the fridge next to a coupon for denture adhesive. The dress I wore that night was navy, simple. The kind of thing you wear when you want to look dignified, but not demanding. I took the train by myself, even though Daniel had promised to send a car. When I arrived at the venue, one of those hotels with mirrors on the ceiling and orchids on the tables, no one met me at the door. I gave my name to the girl with the headset. She paused, scanned her clipboard, then smiled like she'd figured out a puzzle. "Oh, yes, you're on the auxiliary list." She handed me a plain white name tag, not the gold ones the other guests wore. I pinned it to my dress anyway. Inside, the room was all crystal and curated lighting. A string quartet played something soft and forgettable. Waiters floated by with silver trays and hollow smiles. Carla was already surrounded by people, men with firm handshakes and women with impeccable posture. Daniel spotted me and waved, but didn't approach. I stood near the wall for a long time, holding a glass of white wine I didn't sip, watching the crowd orbit around itself. The program began promptly at 8 o'clock. Speeches were made. Stories were shared. A slideshow played photos of various women, some in kitchens, some at protest marches, some smiling with children. At the end of the montage, Daniel took the stage. He spoke well. He always does. He talked about the importance of legacy, of hard choices, of gratitude. He gestured toward the crowd vaguely and said, "People like my own mother, who taught me what perseverance looks like." A few claps. No spotlight turned to me, no invitation to stand. And that's when he leaned over, just before the final toast, and whispered it. "Don't raise your glass." I was about to, you see. I thought maybe this was the moment. Maybe I would be acknowledged, welcomed, seen. But no, I was there to be looked at, not heard. I was decoration, a symbol without a name. I did not raise my glass. I raised the check instead. Quietly. When the dessert was served, I walked up to Carla, handed her a folded envelope, and said, "Here's the donation I promised." She smiled, too wide, too rehearsed, and slipped it into her clutch without opening it. She never would know that it was not the donation I had promised. It was more, much more. It was everything I had left in that old account Daniel didn't know about. I had drained it. Not for them. For me. For closure. For a kind of full stop that no toast could offer. And as the applause echoed and the camera shutters clicked and the room erupted in a standing ovation for a woman who was never named, I walked slowly out of the ballroom, my coat folded over my arm, my hands steady, my back straight. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because I finally understood the truth. The only thing more painful than being invisible is realizing you were never really seen at all. It was the Monday after the gala when I saw the check had cleared. Not just cleared, but cashed immediately, 8:01 a.m., as if someone had been waiting at the bank doors. No thank you message, no acknowledgement, no awkward call or polite text. I watched the notification appear on my banking app while sitting at the small laminate kitchen table in my apartment, the same one where I'd spent decades sorting bills, writing grocery lists, sewing hems by hand under the yellow glare of a single bulb. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood exactly what it meant. The money was taken, willingly, greedily, and I was never going to hear from them about it again. They had gotten what they needed, and now I could fade back into silence, into the background, into the place they had carefully built for me, invisible, convenient, self-erasing. But this time, something in me stalled, not in a loud way, not like a slammed door or a shouted accusation. No, it was more like the quiet click of a lock turning in the opposite direction. Something internal, slow, deliberate, the realization that they would never apologize, because in their eyes, there had never been a wrong to begin with. That night, I sat on my worn blue sofa and pulled out the folder I hadn't opened in nearly 6 years. Inside were photocopies, Old receipts, certified letters, everything I had ever signed for Daniel, the lease from his first apartment, the tuition check from his final year at Columbia, the letter from the bank confirming my transfer of funds for their home's down payment. I'd kept it all, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Because paper grounds memory. Because when you live long enough, you learn that stories shift and people rewrite the past. But facts do not. The receipts had dust on the corners, some ink faded from sunlight, but the numbers remained. And each number told a version of the same story. I gave, and they took. I supported, and they accepted. I showed up, and they vanished. I ran my fingers over the paper slowly, remembering the moments behind the transactions. Daniel standing in my tiny kitchen, asking for help again, his voice coated in shame he disguised as urgency. Carla, sitting politely across from me with a glass of organic juice she never sipped, explaining that the bank would need a family signature to approve the loan. It's just a technicality, Marianne. You won't actually be responsible for anything. And I believe them, because they smiled, because they called me by name, because I wanted to be part of their future so badly that I was willing to mortgage my own. 2 days later, an article appeared in the local paper covering the gala. Carla had submitted the photos. Her name was all over the write-up. Co-host Carla Harlow dazzles at benefit in honor of unsung matriarchs. There was no mention of me, not even in the footnotes. The accompanying photo showed Daniel mid-speech, one hand raised as if blessing the room, the other curled protectively around Carla's waist. I wasn't in the frame. I checked every photo, even the ones buried in the online gallery. I wasn't there. Not in the group shots, not in the table candids. They'd curated the images so carefully, it was as if I hadn't attended at all. And then I saw it. One photo, near the bottom of the gallery, labeled Event Attendees. It showed a cluster of guests near the bar. In the far corner, partially blocked by a waiter's tray, there I was. Blurred, mid-blink, wine glass lowered. No tag. No name. Just a shadow in the corner of someone else's moment. I stared at the screen and felt the heat rise. Not from shame or sadness, but from something deeper, something harder. They didn't just use me. They deleted me. I thought about calling Daniel. Thought about rehearsing the words I would say. That money was my emergency fund. You didn't even say thank you. Do you understand what it means to make someone feel ornamental? But I didn't, because I already knew what he would say. He would apologize without listening. He would remind me how stressful the gala had been, how much Carla had on her plate, how I always take things too personally. He would use that measured, practiced tone he reserved for legal mediation, like love was something to be negotiated. And I was tired. So I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the traffic move slowly beneath the streetlights, and I thought, enough. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that needed an audience, just enough. There comes a point when dignity no longer allows silence, when even the quietest woman hears the click of her own limit. That week, Carla emailed me a thank you note, not for the donation, but for being present at the event. It was 2 sentences long. So lovely to have you with us at the gala. Your calm presence always brings such grace to the room. No mention of the speech. No acknowledgement of what was whispered in my ear before the toast. No indication that she understood, or cared, that I had left in the middle of dessert. She didn't even notice. Or worse, she noticed and chose not to speak. I clicked archive and closed the computer. Then, on Friday, a box arrived. No return address. Inside, a framed photo of the gala centerpiece. White lilies, gold accents, a folded card with the word legacy written in calligraphy. I stared at it for a long time, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked it down to the basement of the building, opened the lid of the trash bin, and dropped it in without ceremony. I didn't keep the ribbon. I didn't save the box. There was nothing to preserve. The moment had passed. The message was clear. I was useful, but not necessary. I was history, not heritage. On Sunday, I went for a walk. The air was cold and wet with the kind of drizzle that never quite becomes rain. I wore my older coat, the brown one with the stitched cuffs. My good coat still hung by the door, untouched since the gala. I passed the florist, the shuttered bank, the newsstand with the local paper on display. The front page had a photo of Carla shaking hands with someone from the mayor's office. The caption read, "Prominent family raises over $80,000 for women's resilience." No footnote, no credits, just Carla's name and Daniel's title. No mention of the woman who had written the biggest check. I returned home, peeled off the coat, boiled water for tea, and sat again at the kitchen table with the old folder. One by one, I pulled out each document and arranged them in neat lines. Not for legal purposes. Not yet. Just to see the shape of my giving. I had no grandchildren photos on the fridge. No gifts from them on my birthday. But I had these papers, and they told a story far more honest than any family slideshow. They said, "I was there. I mattered. I built the foundation under your feet." That night, I pulled out my old notebook and began to write. Not a letter to them. Not a list of grievances. Just a list of what I'd done, what I'd given, what I'd lost. A reckoning, private and precise. The words came slowly at first, then faster. My hand cramped from the motion, but I kept writing. Because when they cashed the check without acknowledgement, they didn't just take my money. They confirmed a pattern. They confirmed I was no longer seen as a person, only as a legacy to be sculpted, a symbol to be paraded, a source to be drained and discarded. And as I set the pen down, I knew. This story was not over, but I would no longer be the footnote. The strange thing about quiet cruelty is that it never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with slammed doors or raised voices or broken dishes. It seeps. It unfolds in smiles that don't reach the eyes, in pauses before invitations, in the subtle redirection of questions you aren't supposed to answer. In the weeks following the gala, the air between me and Daniel grew cooler, but no one would have known it from the outside. He still sent me the occasional forwarded article, a link to a financial newsletter I didn't ask for, a blurry photo of the baby taken from across the room, captioned, "Little Charlotte says, 'Hi.' The baby doesn't speak." Carla would sometimes comment on my Facebook posts with vague hearts or the word beautiful, but never with anything that acknowledged who I was to her or what I meant. I began to notice that every time they tagged photos of family gatherings, birthdays, backyard brunches, beach days, I was never included. Sometimes I wasn't invited. Sometimes they said it was last minute, and they assumed I'd be tired. Once they forgot to tell me Charlotte had been christened. I saw it online the next morning. Daniel in a navy suit holding her above the baptismal font, Carla in pale pink with her parents on either side, and my granddaughter's name etched into a cake I'd never see. I stared at the photo and realized that a woman I didn't recognize was holding the child in the final frame, a woman identified as Charlotte's godmother and family friend. No one told me there was a ceremony. No one told me they had chosen someone else to take that place. I didn't call to ask why. I didn't even cry. I just sat at my table with the blinds drawn and watched the light fade in strips across the carpet. I remember thinking that I had somehow become too large and too invisible all at once. Someone they couldn't erase entirely but didn't want in the frame either. Like an old watermark that shows through when the lighting is wrong. You can't say it's not there, but you don't want to admit that it is. I noticed it in small things too. When Carla invited me to brunch once, just once to a small restaurant with too many mirrors and dishes that looked like plants arranged for autopsy, I overheard her tell the hostess, "Table for 3." I was the fourth. They didn't correct the reservation. We squeezed in. I was seated at the corner, half cut off from the conversation. When I spoke, no one looked up. When I laughed, it hung in the air like a leftover note. When the bill came, Carla reached for it and said, "Oh, don't worry. This one's on us. You've done enough." The way she said "enough" sounded more like a closing remark than a kindness. After that, the invitations stopped entirely. Or maybe they had never really been for me. Daniel would mention events in past tense. We had a lovely dinner with the Kleins last weekend, and I'd nod like I hadn't been sitting 2 miles away, eating reheated soup and listening to the pipes groan in my ceiling. I started to realize that my number was saved on his phone not as Mom, but probably as Marianne Cross. A contact, a contingency, a source. I became more aware of how they spoke about me to others. Once, while visiting the boutique near my apartment, where Carla occasionally shopped for throw pillows or soy candles, I overheard her speaking to a woman I assumed was a neighbor. "She's very independent," Carla said of me, smiling. "She's one of those older women who doesn't need much. We try to keep her involved, of course, but she likes her own space." I stood behind a display of linen napkins and blinked. Not much. My own space. Like I was a plant with minimal watering instructions. Daniel began forwarding me articles about estate planning, trusts, simplifying one's legacy. No explanations, just links. No subject line, no message. Just a passive drip of control, masked as helpfulness. I'd open my email and see them lined up like unopened pills in a plastic tray. One night I replied, "Thanks. I'll consider it." And he responded with a thumbs-up emoji. An emoji. I, who had typed his high school essays on a typewriter, who had handwritten the speech for his graduation ceremony when he lost his voice from bronchitis, I got a thumbs-up emoji. I started to wonder if I'd been demoted in their lives from participant to placeholder, a kind of living memorial that looked better in silence. Meanwhile, my own life shrank. Not dramatically, just subtly. I stopped cooking full meals. I stopped making lists. I stopped watering the plant by the window. I began to wake up without urgency, move through the day with a kind of soft detachment. I would sit in my chair and reread the same paragraph 3 times. I would walk to the post office just to feel my feet on the pavement. I would pass neighbors and smile, and they would smile back, not knowing how much space I was no longer allowed to occupy. And I would think, this is what it feels like to become the outline of a person. To be present in form, but not function. The echo of usefulness. One afternoon, I received a package from Carla. No note, just a beige cardigan, soft and shapeless, with a tag still on. It was one of those sweaters meant to blend into any room, the kind that erases the body inside it. I tried it on and looked in the mirror. I looked like a woman attending her own disappearance. I folded it back into the box and placed it in the hall closet, behind the coats no one wears. It sat there like an unopened metaphor. I did not thank her. Then came the dinner party. Not for me, of course, for Daniel's colleagues. I was invited to stop by for dessert, a phrase so loaded with exclusion it might as well have been a locked door. When I arrived, the living room was already full. Lawyers, clients, the wives of men who used the word "my team" instead of "my staff." I was handed a flute of something sparkling and ushered toward a corner. The kitchen was lit like a showroom. Carla glided through the space with practiced ease, and Daniel nodded at me from across the room like I was someone he vaguely recognized from the elevator. At one point, someone asked me, "And how do you know the Harlow family?" I blinked. Before I could answer, Carla laughed lightly and said, She's just family, in a tone that suggested that word meant anything but. No one pressed further. They didn't want to know. At the end of the evening, I offered to help clear plates. Carla said, "Oh no, Marianne, just relax. You've done enough again." That phrase. Enough. Like a seal placed over a finished container. I stood for a moment in the kitchen, holding a glass with lipstick not mine, and realized I had stopped being a person to them. I had become a role, background, archive, something to be honored from a distance, like a portrait no one really likes but keeps out of obligation. I set the glass down, went to the guest bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in a long time, but I stared for a long time at the reflection of a woman who had made space her whole life, space for others to grow, thrive, succeed, and now found herself edged into the margins of her own story. That night, back in my apartment, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the documents again, the old receipts, the notes in Daniel's childhood handwriting, the faded photograph of the two of us taken outside his high school on the day of his graduation. I stared at my younger self, stubborn, exhausted, proud, and wondered if she would recognize the woman sitting here now. I think she would, and I think she'd be furious. Something in me was starting to stir, not loudly, not in fury, but in clarity. I realized I didn't need to wait for permission to matter. I didn't need a platform or a podium or a toast. I had proof. I had paper. I had time. And I had had enough. Not of love, not of motherhood, but of erasure, of the polite, practiced, passive version of being removed from a life I built. They didn't slam the door. They just walked ahead and didn't look back. And now, standing quietly in the shadow of their curated world, I knew I would not wait for them to notice I was gone. I would decide to go. It began, as many changes do, not with a scream or a bang, but with a quiet decision made over a mug of lukewarm tea and a faded envelope I hadn't opened in years. I'd found it wedged between cookbooks on the high shelf above the stove, where I'd tucked it away a decade ago, thinking I'd come back to it someday. It was a letter from my husband, written shortly before his death, back when Daniel was still in law school, and I was still in the habit of thinking everything we gave would someday return to us in love. The letter was short but deliberate, his handwriting careful in a way it hadn't been since the tremors began. He wrote, "Marianne, don't let them write your story without your permission. You've built too much to be turned into a footnote." I sat with that sentence for a long time. It didn't shout. It didn't instruct. It just stood there, simple and immovable, like a stone in water that refuses to sink. I folded the letter slowly with both hands and placed it next to my notebook on the table. Then I opened a drawer and pulled out the small leather-bound checkbook I'd used only twice in the past year, once to help Daniel with a tax payment, and once to donate to the community library that still sent me thank you postcards in the mail. That afternoon, I walked 2 blocks to the credit union and asked to speak with a manager. I wore my old gray coat with the patched cuff and my hair tied back, and when the young man behind the desk asked if I had an appointment, I smiled politely and said, "No, but I have 40 years of deposits and 3 signatures you'll want to verify." That got me a chair. I sat down and explained calmly that I wanted to transfer everything in my personal account to a new account under my full maiden name, remove all linked profiles, and request a full printout of my financial history. The manager nodded, hesitated, then asked if I had a specific reason. I looked him in the eye and said, "I just realized I've been too generous with people who assume I don't know how to count." He didn't laugh. He printed the documents. I signed each page slowly, carefully, the way women do when we've been told for too long that we don't understand the terms. Then I tucked the printout into my bag and walked out, past the poster advertising retirement planning, past the woman offering sample mints, into the cold air of a city I suddenly felt awake inside. Later that evening, I returned to the folder, spread it across the table, and did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote down numbers, not just totals, not just dollar signs, but what each expense had meant. $7,200 for Daniel's first semester, marked with a note. He cried when he got the acceptance letter. $240,000 for the down payment. He promised I could stay as long as I wanted. $18.32 for the casserole dish I left at their house after Charlotte was born. They never returned it. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I just wrote. Because it wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about being erased slowly, efficiently, by people who had decided that love is only valid if it fits into the design of their lives. But I wasn't interested in fitting anymore. I was interested in remembering. The next morning, I walked to the bookstore and bought myself a hardcover journal, thick and unlined, the kind that feels like it's meant for something permanent. On the first page, I wrote, "This is my version." Then I walked to a lawyer's office across town, the one I'd passed every week on my way to the pharmacy, but never thought I'd enter. The receptionist looked startled when I said I didn't have an appointment. The lawyer was young, kind-eyed, with a tie that didn't quite match his shirt. I liked him immediately. I said, "I want to talk about boundaries." Legal ones. He asked if I was in any immediate danger. I said no. Just in long-term erosion. I explained what I wanted. A new will, a power of attorney that didn't include Daniel, and documentation clarifying that my financial independence was not under question. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and got to work. I felt something loosen inside me, like a belt finally unclasped after decades of holding in breath. When I walked out of the office, I passed an elderly man standing outside smoking a pipe, and for no reason at all, I smiled at him. He smiled back, tipped his cap, and said, "Whatever it is, ma'am, good on you." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. That evening, I cooked for myself for the first time in weeks. A real meal. Potatoes roasted with rosemary, green beans with slivered almonds, chicken in a lemon glaze I used to make on Sundays when Daniel was small and liked to help with the stirring. I ate at the table, not in front of the TV, and when I finished, I lit a candle. Not because anyone was watching, just because I could. I sat in the quiet and thought about the difference between solitude and loneliness. I had never minded being alone. What I minded was being made to feel that I existed only in the spaces others left behind. But this stillness, this clarity, this small act of ownership over my own dinner, it felt like the beginning of something. Not a return to the past, not a rebellion against the present, just a shift, a turn in the road, a soft, steady change in direction that no one else could define for me. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't make a post or send a letter or call to announce the news. I just went to bed with clean sheets, slept with the window cracked open, and woke the next morning with the simplest, rarest of thoughts. I am not waiting anymore. In the weeks that followed my decision to reclaim not just my finances but my sense of self, something curious began to happen. The world didn't end. The invitations didn't cascade in. No grand confrontation surged through my phone like a tidal wave of guilt or guiltless acknowledgement. Instead, life around me carried on in its peculiar way, as if I had tapped into a channel of reality that had been quietly humming underneath decades of polite erasure. I walked each morning to the little cafe down the street where they remembered my usual black coffee without asking, where the barista commented once, "You look different," in a warm tone that had nothing to do with vanity. It was the kind of observation that says, "I notice you, and I mean more than just your order." On an afternoon just before dusk, I sat in the park and watched children circle the fountain, their laughter floating on the breeze, and I realized how Long it had been since I allowed myself to witness beauty without the filter of obligation or longing. I sat there until the sky turned lavender and the stars came out, and I cracked open my new journal and wrote until my fingers stung. I wrote of a woman who had been made small and unseen, and of the slow, steady rise of recognition that she could exist in full again, without apology. But while I was mapping my reclamation in quiet, deliberate strokes, the world of the Gala and its aftershock, the world constructed by Carla's subtle dismissals and Daniel's silent withdrawals, tried to reassert itself in blurry, loaded ways. At the end of one dreary Tuesday, my phone rang. It was Carla. I don't know what I expected. Perhaps an olive branch disguised as an invitation, or an awkward apology coded in social nicety. But what came through the line was neither that nor a silence. It was the brittle politeness of contract. "We're hosting a donor luncheon next week," she said, as if I were a name on a guest list, rather than a mother who might, or might not, be invited. "We'd be honored if you could join us." She paused as if waiting for an affirmation, then swiftly added, "Of course, no need to. I know you're busy, but we thought you might like the company." In that moment, I felt myself shrink, like I'd been offered a chair at a table reserved for people who simply look like they belong, not people who belong themselves. I replied with a soft, "Thank you. I'll let you know," and ended the call before my voice cracked. I didn't let her know. I taped the call into a plastic pocket in my notebook, next to the printed bank statement and the letter from my husband. I didn't reply. Days passed. I saw how my absence in that virtual space unsettled the narrative. They began asking about other donors, about guest confirmations, and eventually someone left a message at my door. A pale envelope through the mail slot containing a card that read, "Missing your presence." I stared at it and realized that presence is an abstraction, safer to call harmless. But what they missed was something more essential: acknowledgement, visibility. I tossed the card into the recycling bin without reading it again. Then, an incident in the quiet gray of a Thursday unsettled me more than any grand drama could. I was in the grocery store, standing in line, eyeing apples so good they almost looked impossible, when I overheard a young woman behind me ask the cashier about me. She spoke like she was offering a kindness, but her tone was sympathetic, like when someone pats your hand at a funeral saying, "I'm sorry for your loss," not knowing you weren't grieving, only invisible. The cashier, who knows me by name, said, "Oh, Marianne's just someone who doesn't come here much anymore. She's been busy, you know." Busy. Busy with nothing that matters, apparently. I bit my lip so the end of my smile didn't fall. I paid for my groceries and walked out in the drizzle, the weight of their fiction following me like wet clothes clinging to skin. I carried that moment with me for days. It burned like memory until it solidified into resolve. I realized that erasure doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's a whisper that echoes between the stolen stories, and it's louder than any scream. The decision didn't spark in anger. It bloomed quietly in clarity. I began to write letters. Not accusatory ones, not declarations, but letters of quiet truth, delivered to the people closest to the world that had erased me. One I left at their house, addressed simply to Daniel, with no return address. Inside I wrote of the ledger, the receipts, the degrees paid for, the down payment, and of the fading photo of the two of us in a high school parking lot on graduation day. I told him I was not bitter, but lived. I told him that I no longer needed to be invited to recognition, because I had recognized myself. The letter was neither sent nor received. I slipped it inside their mailbox and left without a word, but I didn't look back. It was my story, not theirs. Around that time, a local writer invited me to share a memory for a newspaper column titled "Voices of Our Town." I agreed, not because it was a platform, but because it used real space on a page, not just curated image space in a family blog. I spoke on paper of resilience and erasure and the simple necessity of being seen. The next Sunday, the column ran. My name and words appeared in print. Because I had asked not for praise but for presence, the ink was black and steady. I cut out the column and framed it. I hung it on my kitchen wall, where I see it each morning. I don't call it art. It's testimony. Meanwhile, they noticed. Not immediately. Life among the river of privilege can take time to pause. But after a few weeks, Daniel's tone in our messages shifted. He sent a photo of Charlotte's drawing, scribbles that looked like a rainbow in a tree, and said, "Hope you like it." A rainbow, yes. One she drew, but a gesture. I replied, "Thank you, I do." It wasn't a surrender, it was still presence. A bridge extended from me, not for them or to them, but for me. I was responding not from expectation, but from choice. Carla, on her part, began to post pictures of her mornings with coffee, the sunlight through the curtains. In the comments, she tagged me once. "Morning thoughts. Wish we were lounging like this together." It felt like an offer. I didn't accept. I didn't reply. I let it hang there, visible, public, as the choice I made in the world. I can appear on terms that make sense to me, not theirs. My own rhythm. One evening, well into the dusk, I received a call from a woman I barely knew, the editor of a small local radio station. She said she'd heard about the column and wondered if I would speak briefly on air about staying visible in later life. I said yes. The next day, I went to the studio. I sat in the cold glass booth, microphone at my chin, and spoke, not as someone asking to be seen, but someone affirming her own presence. My voice, unfiltered and warm, filled the silent world of airwaves. After the segment, people wrote to me, neighbors half remembered, childhood friends I hadn't spoken to in years, new acquaintances who said, "I heard, you say?" And I felt seen too. That night I sat with my journal, writing not because I needed to, remember, but because I had to keep the record of sight alive. By the time I turned off the light, I understood something. That power was not in demanding acknowledgement, but in choosing your own visibility. The world could recognize me when it was ready, or it might never. But I no longer needed permission to matter. I had already started living as if that was enough. The check was lifted. The voice, no longer silent, had found its own cadence. And I, at last, was no longer a shadow, but someone unfolding into the light she built. The moment of no return came not in a courtroom or a family confrontation, but on an ordinary Wednesday morning when I found a man in a beige suit standing outside the cafe where I'd taken to having my second cup of coffee. He didn't wear his discomfort on his sleeve. He wore it in the stiffness of his spine, in the way his briefcase hung too neatly from his wrist, in the calculated blankness of his smile. He waited until I finished my coffee, then approached the counter and said my name as if reading from a file. "Mrs. Marianne Cross. Harlow?" I nodded. "I represent your son and daughter-in-law. They've asked me to reach out regarding your well-being." I looked him up and down, saw the paperwork peeking out of his folder, guardianship forms, preliminary estate documents, and a typed letter I recognized not from the handwriting but the tone, clipped, sanitized, protective on the surface but laced with control. I didn't invite him to sit. I didn't take the folder. I simply said, "Tell Daniel and Carla I'm no longer available for management, and remind them that I am of sound mind, living in a sound world, and that I didn't disappear." I stepped away. The man hesitated. "They're concerned about your safety." I raised an eyebrow and said, "What a lovely thing to claim after they asked me not to raise my glass in public." I left him standing there, awkward and blinking, a man whose job was to carry worry like a performance, not a truth. That afternoon, I went home and sat at my desk, where the envelope with my lawyer's letter still lay unopened from the day I had it notarized. It was a simple letter, dry in tone but fierce in intention, stating that any further legal contact made under false pretense would be considered harassment, and that I had secured local representation. I signed it in dark ink, folded it into a fresh envelope, and mailed it with a stamp that had a goldfinch on it. Small, sharp-eyed, unapologetically vocal. I walked back slowly from the mailbox, feeling the weight of the years shift on my shoulders, not lighten exactly, but redistribute themselves in a way that made me taller. That letter was not an act of war. It was a declaration of boundary, a final act in a long play that had demanded I stay seated through scenes in which I never had a line. The next day, I wrote a much shorter letter. This one to Carla. 3 sentences. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I finally started mine. I wrote it without bitterness. I wrote it as a woman who no longer needed to be interpreted. I mailed it without hesitation. That night I sat with my tea by the window, watching the wind pull through the alley like a dog searching for its owner, and I thought, not with sadness but with awe, of how long I had waited for someone to see me before I remembered I could open my own eyes. The next week, an article appeared in the local Wilmington newspaper. A photo of me from a Thanksgiving years ago, holding a pie dish, smiling into a camera I didn't know was watching. The headline, Family Seeks Help Locating Beloved Matriarch. Quotes from Daniel and Carla. All feigned concern, all performance. We miss her. We just want to know she's safe. She's not the type to disappear. I laughed when I read it, not cruelly, but in a kind of disbelief so complete it came out of my lungs like relief. Not the type. Not the type to disappear, but somehow very much the type to be silenced, to be omitted, to be used as a symbol and then shelved. I cut out the article and placed it in my journal, not out of nostalgia, but as evidence, proof of how people only fear what they can no longer use. Joyce, my landlady and now companion in late-night television and boxed wine, glanced at the clipping and said, "You should sue them for underestimating you." I said, "They'd have to get in line." A few days later, Carla appeared in person. She came to the cafe, dressed as if she were stepping into a board meeting, not a small place that smelled like burnt toast and wet coats. She didn't order anything. She stood by the pastry case and said my name. I didn't flinch. I was wiping down the counter. I kept wiping. When she finally stepped forward and asked if we could talk, I gestured toward the back booth. "You're talking now," I said. She sat down like a woman entering a confessional. "We didn't mean to exclude you," she began. "The gala. It got complicated. Daniel was overwhelmed. The event was—" I cut her off, not with volume, but with stillness. "You asked me not to speak. That's not complication. That's choice." She looked down at her hands, and for the first time I noticed they were shaking. "I didn't want your shadow in every room," she whispered. I nodded. "And now you don't have to worry about it." She tried to offer a photo of Charlotte. I didn't take it. She said Kieran, her stepson, my only grandchild who ever came to me without asking, had been asking for me, that he missed me. I said, "He knows how to find me." I ended the conversation there, not in anger, but in completion. I left her sitting in that booth, unfinished, and returned to the counter, where my apron waited and the floor still needed mopping. That night I wrote a final note. Not to them, to myself. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. I taped it to the inside of my dresser drawer, behind the recipe cards and the folded letter from my husband, because some truths need to live in the dark a while before they light the rest of your life. And then, with clean sheets on my bed and the hum of evening in the pipes of this quiet, borrowed house, I slept. Not as a woman waiting to be seen, but as a woman who had finally stood fully in the center of her own name. The silence afterward was not emptiness, it was fullness. It was the kind of quiet that arrives when a room is finally cleared of everything that does not belong, when the clutter of pretending, the weight of waiting, the echo of unspoken grief all lift at once, and what remains is something cleaner than peace, clarity. In the weeks that followed Carla's visit and the article in the paper, I stopped checking for updates. I no longer looked at their social media pages. I didn't scroll through photos of family gatherings to spot my absence. I stopped imagining a version of life where they remembered what I gave, where they acknowledged my name not in scripted tributes, but in daily honesty. I had spent too many years confusing love with usefulness, attention with respect, performance with presence. Now, every morning, I wake with no questions hanging over the day. My name belongs to me again, not as Daniel's mother, not as the donor or the matriarch or the background figure, just Marianne. That is enough. Most mornings I walk, not far, just enough to remind my body that I still carry myself. I pass the bookstore that now carries a small stack of local essays, including mine, with a note that reads, "By residents who still know how to tell the truth." I visit the library and nod to the librarian who once helped me print a copy of the first letter I sent to my lawyer. I return home by 10, make tea, and write. Not every word needs to be beautiful. Not every sentence must say something profound. Sometimes I just list things I noticed. The way the birds gather before it rains, the way the street lamp flickers exactly at 7:42, the exact tone of the sky when it decides to forgive the sun. These are not scraps of time. They are not filler. They are my hours. Mine. I've begun sorting through my boxes. Things I used to think I'd pass down. Heirlooms I assumed would find their way to some curated shelf in a house that no longer belongs to me. Now I touch each one and decide its fate without expectation. Some I give to the church. Some I return to thrift stores, anonymous. Some I keep. Letters, photographs, my father's razor, my mother's rosary, a handkerchief embroidered with my initials from a time when people still sewed care into cloth. These are not relics. They are witnesses. I keep them not so they'll be inherited, but so I can be accompanied. One afternoon, while dusting the hallway, I came across a small mirror I hadn't looked into in months. It's round and a little warped, hung at an awkward angle, but as I passed, I caught my reflection, and for a moment, I stopped. Not because I looked beautiful. I didn't. My skin was loose, my hair uneven, my eyes tired in that permanent way that comes from a life lived too much for others. But there I was, entire, unapologetic. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just nodded to myself, the way one nods to someone they've finally learned to respect. Then I turned off the light. I know now that closure is not a letter or an apology. It's not a public reconciliation or shared understanding. Closure is a door you walk through alone, and on the other side, you don't find resolution. You find yourself. I don't regret the money. I don't even regret the years. I regret only the time I spent shrinking so others could feel more generous. But even that regret feels old now, like a bruise that's lost its tenderness. I don't need revenge. I don't need them to see me. I see myself. To any woman reading this, any woman sitting quietly in a corner of her own life, waiting for permission to speak, to stand, to be, let me tell you something. No one told me soon enough. You don't owe them your silence. You don't owe them your soft edges or your edited stories or your invisible labor dressed up as tradition. If they only love you when you're quiet, it isn't love. If they only welcome you when you serve, it isn't family. You are not here to decorate someone else's success. You are not here to be curated. You are here. That is enough. And next time, if there is a next time, I will raise my glass. Not because they asked me to, not because it's my turn, but because the glass is mine and so is the toast,